Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and compare the iPad 10 generation and the iPad 7 generation and see which specific iPad you should go and pick up. Now, obviously, I will tell you, if you have all the money in the world, definitely get the iPad 10. That is going to be the better iPad in, I think, pretty much every single area. But the iPad 7 is still very interesting because it's still supported with software. And I will say these two iPads share one similar thing in common. They brought somewhat of a new redesign to their specific iPad lineup. Now, what does this mean? Well, essentially, back when the iPad 7 generation came out a few years ago, this iPad before, the iPad 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, those had 9.7-inch displays. At least with the iPad 6, that one had a 9.7-inch display, and it really wasn't that bad of a panel. When the iPad 7 generation came out, it actually ended up bringing a 10.2-inch Retina display on that specific panel. So it was a bigger display now, which was actually very interesting. And I believe this was one of the first times we saw a bigger size increase for their standard, cheaper iPad lineup. Now, another thing they did, which was very interesting, was they slimmed down the bezels on the side of the iPad. And I actually did like this a lot. By them slimming down those sides of the iPad, I thought that made that iPad look so much better and sleeker. It almost reminded me somewhat of like the iPad Pro 2nd generation or the iPad Air 3. I love that type of design, and this iPad almost kind of replicated that type of design, which was actually really interesting. Now, with the iPad 10th generation, this is a little bit of a different story. Apple has completely changed their way that they're kind of viewing, I'm assuming, their cheaper iPad lineup. So now it is a much better looking 10.9-inch Liquid Retina display. So this one also supports True Tone, which is really cool as well. And I love that, having an iPad that looks like this, that has this much capability and almost looks like a Pro. I love that kind of stuff. But Apple made some weirder decisions, which we'll get into in a second. But with this newer modern design, it is definitely better looking than the iPad 7. The issue that we're having is for this type of design, we are going up in cost. When the iPad 7 came out, it was a pretty cheap iPad, and a lot of people, especially students, picked these iPads up because they were very, very cheap to buy. Now with the iPad 10, for $449 compared to, I believe, the $329 when the iPad 7 came out, it is now a little bit more expensive, actually quite a bit more expensive to buy the iPad 10 than it is to buy the iPad 7. So that is kind of an unfortunate thing in that specific situation. I feel like Apple probably should have just gone over and just kept it at the same price tag, or done like $399. I think $449 puts it too close to the iPad mini 6 and the iPad Air 5, considering that this thing looks almost identically the same as those things. So I guess we're going to see what happens in the future, but as of right now, I will probably still tell you, I kind of think that the iPad 10 generation still looks better than the iPad 7, but it's very interesting. They both kind of share the same type of, like they brought somewhat of a new design. Now, the iPad 7 has that older designed curved side lightning port, headphone jack as well, which is cool. The iPad 10th generation actually brings a flat side now, which is very interesting. Now, I kind of laugh a little bit because it's very, very funny because the flat side does not bring Apple Pencil 2 support. Typically, we would see that this thing also supports USB-C, but it still has Apple Pencil 1 support. So because of that, you have to buy a dongle separately for the iPad 10, and it is a very, very weird thing. I don't understand why Apple did this. I mean, I do understand it's because of money, but I feel like, they shouldn't have done this. It was a very, very weird way of them going through and just getting more sales of the Apple Pencil 1 and the extra dongle that we have to buy now, but it is what it is. And that's probably the main reason I would recommend going for another iPad like the Mini 6 or the iPad Air 5 or another one like the iPad Air 4, because those things support Apple Pencil 2. Now on the back, we have the standard flat backs, which are nice, Apple logo in the center, camera on the top left. And that kind of covers up the design. There's not really a completely crazy amount else that's, super different between them. However, the camera sensors are actually quite a bit different. So with the iPad 7th generation, we had an 8 megapixel wide angle camera, and then we had a 1.2 megapixel FaceTime HD camera, whatever they're going to call it. I believe that front camera was 720p. Now with the iPad 10th generation, we have a 12 megapixel wide angle camera, and we have a 12 megapixel landscape ultra wide front camera. So what's really cool about that front camera is that it is now in landscape mode. So I actually prefer this. If you're taking phone calls or FaceTime calls or Zooms or whatever, you'll actually be able to go ahead and keep your iPad in portrait mode and not have to look at the side of the screen. Much similar to like on a MacBook where you can just kind of look at the display. It looks like you're looking at the person. Now it's not like you have to look at the side of the panel. You can just look normally, and I really, really like that. Now the best way to describe this camera comparison is that a lot of people might not even need to use their iPad for camera unless there's a reason you're using your iPad camera. Then get the iPad 10. But the iPad 7 generation pretty much has the same camera almost as like an iPhone 6. the iPad 10th generation has the same camera almost as like an iPhone 10R with like an iPhone maybe 14 or iPhone 13 front camera, something along those lines. So I would probably tell you the iPad 10 is going to be the better way to go in every single area, including the chipset inside, which is going to improve those photos a little bit. You might want to go for the iPad 10 than the iPad 7 in my opinion. So this is kind of a quick camera comparison, mostly because it's quite obvious which one is better. But this does bring me to software and longevity. Now, like I had mentioned with the cameras, right? The iPhone 6 camera on the iPad 7, the iPhone like 12, 13, whatever you want to talk about on the iPhone, on the iPad 10. What's different now is with those chipsets, the iPad 7 has that Apple A10 Fusion chip inside, which is the same chipset as the iPhone 7. The iPad 10 has the Apple A14 Bionic chip that has the same chipset as the iPhone 12. So this is a pretty big difference between the two because you are getting a way better chipset and a way more optimized chipset and a newer chipset on the iPhone 12 than the iPhone 7. So in this case with the iPad 10 and the iPad 7, you are getting a way better chipset on the iPad 10. So I will definitely tell you, in my opinion, getting something like an iPad 10 is going to be giving you a much longer lasting experience. But also when it comes down to the performance segment, like you are comparing a phone that came out many years ago that's unsupported with software technically, although the iPad 7 is still supported with software, compared to the iPhone 12, which just came out a few years ago and is still sold by Apple. When I look at these two devices, the iPad 7, I think is still, completely okay. I know people who still use the iPad 6 and still like it. With the iPad 7, I think this is still a very decent iPad for its price tag, for its age, and for how, cheap you can probably get it at this point of what it is. I think this iPad is still decent, right? It's not competing or outperforming the iPad 10 in any way. Personally, I think this would be the bottleneck. I think this iPad I would probably need a little bit more power from just because I have so much experience with the iPhone 7 and this chipset that I do feel like with something like the iPad 10, it's going to be giving you a much better experience for sure. Now, specifically, I will definitely tell you with that A14 Bionic chip, from all the experience I've ever done, uploading speeds, if you're going through and you're kind of like video editing, if you're playing heavy intensive games or anything even remotely related to that, having a newer chipset is always going to be a better situation here. And in this specific situation, you are definitely going to be getting an overall better performing iPad from the iPad 10. Now, if you're somebody who needs to go ahead and have if you're somebody who, needs the most amount of power, the iPad 10 is definitely the better way to go. But if you're just taking notes and you're just watching videos and you're just doing anything crazy, then I think the iPad 7 is completely fine as well. But I'd probably say the iPad 10 is definitely the better way to go in the power segment. Now, some other minor things that I may have not, kind of hit on. The iPad 10 supports 5G, where the iPad 7 supports 4G. They both have Touch ID, which is nice. And the storage goes up to 128 gigabytes on the iPad 7, whereas on the iPad 10, it does go up to 256 gigabytes. So that might be a minor thing to kind of keep in mind at the end of the day as well. And to kind of sum up this whole entire comparison, what I will tell you is that I think if you still own the iPad 7, I would highly recommend keeping it. I really don't think there's that big of a reason to go from an iPad 7 to an iPad 10 right now, mostly because the iPad 7 is still supported with software. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, and I think it's still going to be relevant for probably another year or so. But with the iPad 10, I think if you aren't coming from either one of these iPads and you want to future-proof yourself the most, I think the iPad 10 is a decent option. But at that point, like I mentioned, I would either go and buy an iPad Air 4 in the used market. I would rather buy an iPad Mini 6 or an iPad, Air 5 in the used market as well. Or if you can make it, if you can spend a little bit more if your budget is higher, getting the iPad Pros is definitely going to be a better option. But that's kind of how both these iPads compare for the most part. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.